Right, good.
Good.
David, my colleague from Humanists for Science. In fact, I think it's right in saying you founded Humanists.
I first convened,
Yeah.
if that is foundation. And Chris was one of the first to join.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about cause and effect now. So there's this kind of fictitious Spanish village. Some villages have headaches and they're confused and they're drowsy. How, for example, do we determine some villages' current illness as a result of drinking some arsenic-contaminated water? And there are 4 problems to linking the symptoms to the contaminated water. So the effects of drinking contaminated water, headache, confusion, drowsiness, vary. And the less specific any effect, or the more varied the possible effects, the harder it is to be sure that the agent is responsible for the effect. And any one of these effects may not be evident immediately. In the intervening period, we may have been exposed to other potential agents such as alcohol or cross-infection, personal stomachs. So the longer the delay between exposure to the agent and any effects, the harder it is to be sure that the agent has a causal relationship with the effect. And other causes may occur in the intervening period. Another complication in this example is that a companion who drinks the same water may report no ill effects. The greater range in susceptibility to the agent, or the fewer people who are susceptible to it, the harder it is to establish any causal relationships. And finally, we may have drunk water from the source before and suffered no ill effects. And the less likely an agent is to have the same effect on every exposure, i.e. the less reliable the agent is, the harder it is to establish any causal relationship. So this example illustrates the 4 separate components that diminish our confidence in determining cause and effect, namely effect, delay, susceptibility, and reliability. And these components are all examples of variability, and can be summarised as where variability is high, it's more difficult to determine cause and effect, and where it's low, it's less difficult, i.e. easier to determine cause and effect. So observations should be objective and uninfluenced by the observer. But objectivity in observations is hard to achieve, both philosophically and practically. So replication encompasses both the repetition of the observation by the same observer and also the observation of the phenomenon by different observers. But no amount of observation and measurement will generate an explanation without the inspiration of the scientist. The scientist seeks to establish cause and effect relationship between objects or events so that the current observation can be understood, and hence earlier events deduced or future events predicted. The initial proposal of the relationship is a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is the initial best fit, or I like to call it the guess of the observation. If that hypothesis is correct, then certain other observations will be anticipated or predicted. And these other observations are then sought, and the process continues round and round, ad infinitum. So the scientific method is this cycle of observation and hypothesis testing. And so a hypothesis is defined as a testable statement or explanation. Ultimately, the principal outcome of scientific investigation is a verified or rejected hypothesis. For example, in the case of the villagers, with the arsenic poisoning, the question may be about whether there is arsenic contamination of the local water supply from a single well. So the 2 alternative answers to the question is there arsenic in the water supply, testable statements. So yes, there is arsenic in the water supply, and no, there is no arsenic in the water supply. And so that latter statement, which is the negative, no, there is no water supply, no arsenic in the water supply, is the null hypothesis. And the former statement, the positive, yes, there is arsenic in the water supply, that's the alternative hypothesis, which is also known as the experimental hypothesis. Okay. That was one of the points about the course. They were really keen on getting us not only just to think about hypothesis, but to use that discipline to create a null hypothesis as well. And often you actually had to revamp it several times to make sense. So scientific theories, well, they fit in. Obviously, a hypothesis is a statement or explanation of the relationship between a few observations. But a theory is bigger. A theory is a series of interrelated logical statements that make sense of a number of pieces of evidence. And probably the widest known theory is the theory of evolution by natural selection. And that coherently links together evidence, observations from fossils, genetics, and their distribution of a similar process. I'm going to quote a guy called Stephen Law. And he says that he talks about scientism, which is obviously related to this quote, the original quote. And Stephen Law, who's heard of Stephen Law? All fine. He says that the view that science, by application of the scientific method, can ultimately explain everything, can answer every legitimate or meaningful question, is called scientism. Are there questions that science is not, perhaps cannot answer? So take moral questions. Is killing always wrong? Is it morally acceptable to design a baby? Science can make new technologies possible, including weapons of mass destruction and genetic engineering. But says Stephen Law, science cannot tell us whether it is ever morally permissible ever to use such technologies. It seems, as the philosopher David Hume famously noted, that science ultimately reveals only what is the case. It cannot tell us what we ought or ought not to do. So scientism, according to Stephen Law, certainly does appear to be false. There do appear to be questions science can answer that extend beyond its proper domain. And I'm just wondering, has anybody got any views on scientism?
I'm arguing that science is giving rise to sort of ethical and moral behavior, such as sustainable development. Now, it's encompassing all our professional activities. It is the government is taking into policies, and so it's becoming part of our consciousness. Maybe this is too little. We need to do much more than that. But the scientific practice has already created, if you like, an attribute or something there that is becoming, reaching moral practice or the level of moral practice.
Has anybody got any comments on your, sorry, what's your name?
Ram.
Any comments on Raman's comments on that? Yeah, go on.
I agree with you completely, but then beneath that you could say that science is reacting to an agreed desire within our human race that destroying the planet or whatever you're saying, the environment, is a bad thing. So, and it's responding to that in a way, but that it's harm. If in our nature we naturally thought that the Earth was a resource to destroy and then move on, science probably wouldn't be doing that, kind of trying to spread that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
to explanation.
Yeah.
along that line, I'm saying that too much use of certain things brings whatever that is to the point of entropy. It creates disorder. And this disorder that creates the need for adjustment. And sustainable development is a way of adjusting what we are doing.
The other point seems to be that you're making the claim that science doesn't make moral judgments. But then how would you answer...
Stephen Law,
But how would he tackle the sort of the Frankfurt idea that science is actually responsible for immorality? In the idea of course, science gave the Nazis a sense of legitimacy to do what they did with the Holocaust, and therefore, all those kind of elements that science is actually directly responsible for, that would be their argument. So actually, by giving them an absolute, this is the truth that they believe in, and the truth will take me down this logical route, which of course was wrong, but that they believed that to be right. So the science itself took them down a logical course that led to immorality. So it might not lead to moral. I mean, I think the environmentalists, you can lead to morality, but it can also lead to actual immorality, and actually take me down that road that...
That's great. What's your name?
Ian.
Does anybody would like to comment on Ian's?
Yeah. Just should be pointed out that, if you've read Mein Kampf, Hitler does say quite often throughout it that he believes what he believes because of God. And he believes
Yeah, but the...
And I don't think that science gave Chrysler's atrocities or was even used to justify them. It was a belief in Europe for Germany, basically. That is what gave the mission, not science. Science was just a tool used then.
I mean, the actual theory of the dialectic of enlightenment and areas like that, the idea that it was these enlightenment that led to the science, that then led to, this sort of degradation of our morality, is the argument that's brought out by Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, and many others. And they would directly relate that to a sense of how we've become immoral. So, I mean, it's
I was just going to say, we're suddenly bandying the words moral and immorality around, but who's it? Who's morality? Who's immorality? What before you start talking about what's moral and what's immoral, in what culture, in what time, so I just wanted to sort of think maybe we should just backtrack a little bit before we start talking about...
It's not necessarily a question
something
of
right or wrong. What morality?
It's not necessarily a question of morality. Absolutism is really what it comes down to.
Most ethical systems have, various descriptions have a notion that each person is of equal value or equal worth. That tends to be a kind of foundational notion in most ethical systems. And it's hard to see where that comes from, apart from a kind of position of some kind of faith. I don't think that science gets you to the notion that each person is of equal worth and equal value in an ethical system. I don't see how. What kind of experiment could get you there?
I don't see how to get you away from it either.
But you might. You might say, well, people have different intelligence, and therefore, because they're different intelligence and different gender.
That's you applying worth. That's you applying worth to the variables you're feeding into science.
Indeed, I'm just saying that if you wanted to say people are of equal worth, in the end, it's that's a kind of almost a faith belief.
No, that they aren't. And the evidence will show one way or the other, and then you just sit and do it.
Indeed, but what do you...
Chris?
Yes, I mean, it does seem to me that there's one major question that is posed by the traditional religions, who say there are certain types of action which are absolutely forbidden. Some of these you would see as trivial, some of them you would see as important, but they do stand up for that point. They say there are certain types of action which you should be prepared to die rather than do. Now, it seems to me that science wouldn't get you there. Like torture, murder, enslavement, rape, etc. You can always, you've got the ticking bomb scenarios, all that kind of thing, where you can build up imaginary situations where, if you pursue a strict consequentialist logic, you would say, well, you'd have to, push the fat man off the bridge, or torture, or whatever.
But then science can show you
No,
the
let's,
picture.
let's follow the normal procedure of asking to be called by the chair and not
Try and keep
interrupting
it
each
brief.
other. Sorry?
Try and keep it brief.
Yes, but that's the point I want to make. That it doesn't need to be that science delivers absolute prohibitions.
Okay, so we'll come.
Yeah, I was just going to say that science can show with its evidence that torture is, useless. That's it. The other question I wanted to ask was whether actually there are any scientists out there at the moment who hold the scientism as a view, whether there are any scientists that say yes, science can answer every question, bad evidence, or whether it used as a criticism of a lot of scientists. But
Well,
I'm not
you've
sure
got to be careful what you're saying. Are you saying now? You can answer any
Now,
question.
yes.
Are you saying that potentially in the future it can answer any question? Because they're very different positions.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about now in terms of I've seen various people on the internet arguing and using scientism as a criticism of people like Richard Dawkins, things like that.
Science can't even answer every scientific question now. I don't see how you can possibly hold that.
That's I'm asking whether there are any scientists that actually hold the view. So is it really
Well,
a criticism?
on the point about Richard Dawkins, actually, moving into that, because in the God division, he quite unambiguously acknowledges that perhaps there are some genuinely profound and meaningful questions that are forever beyond the reach of science. And so Dawkins seems happy to concede that moral questions may well fall into that category. And he says that we can all agree that science entitlement to advise us on moral values is problematic to say the least.
Just to make a point, it also seems as well that, to take it from a Michael Oakeshott perspective, that science is very good as a mode of knowledge, but it's only one of many, and to accept that it does have its limitations, it does have its answers, it does have its truths, but that you can get that in other ways, so I think it's putting it into perspective as well.
And I'm going to take the case of briefly a Christian apologist, a philosopher who basically takes your view about the happening. In other words, that there are other real truths than just the strict science. And then I'm going to cover Peter Atkins, who is then along the sort of scientism route. Yeah, go on, yeah.
I've read the set that science is an open interpreter and pushed in many directions. So we have got to be quite careful that how we are, if you like, leading science towards it can lead towards what he said about Nazism, helping Nazism, or towards helping acceptable moral standards. It's up to us. Science is an open interpreter.
It's almost a logical point that science is descriptive. It can't go from a descriptive statement to a prescriptive statement. You can agree, on everything about the world, and still not know what to do with the next world.
And of course, the humanist Sam Harris, in his book The Moral Landscape, which was published in 2011, he argues that science can, in fact, answer moral questions. And once morality is understood as those values that lead to human flourishing.
That's the problem. Once it's understood, that you're okay.
And what constitutes flourishing?
No one constitutes
Well,
flourishing.
exactly.
Whether everyone's flourishing is the same value.
And so I mentioned this debate that happened last year. It was actually a Centre for Inquiry conference on scientism last year, and it was called "Can Science Solve Every Mystery?" And it was between Peter Atkins and David Pappan, a philosopher, or Peter Williams, a philosopher. The debate unfortunately clashed with the BHA Leeds annual conference, which I attended. But of course, we've now got a full debate on YouTube. So, right, I'm going to skip some of these slides because I've got a slide here on the scientific method. That was science is our best shot at understanding the universe. That was Dawkins, and that's a very sort of prescriptive sort of formula for what the scientific method is about. This one here is what we were taught on our course about the scientific method, and I think the arrows are, for me are quite interesting. That it's this kind of iterative stance of science, and the point they've got the bit about the hypothesis being you accept the null hypothesis, which is the opposite of your hypothesis. Does that strike true with what you understand by the scientific method?
I don't find this very useful.
Right.
Because people have been arguing about what constitutes the scientific method for all my life. This is a new diagram, life is wrong.
There was also the other scientific method, looking at someone like Firebrand, that anything goes. The argument that science went into an argument with religion and won the argument, not on fact, but purely on argumentation. So, I mean, that was a method then. He created a method of just arguing your point.
Is this full fail?
Yeah, just arguing your point until the other backs down. That kind of, and so anything goes.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a bit of a postmodern view of it, but it's a method.
Okay. Right. So, the Centre for Inquiry Debate, those are the guys. It's Stephen Moore chairing it, those three. There's Stephen Law, and this is Peter Williams. Now he's a philosopher and Christian apologist, and they all spoke for about 40 minutes, but I'm going to summarise Peter Williams' talk. Well, I'm not even going to summarise it. I'm just going to take bits out. So he says that science comes from the Latin scientia, meaning knowledge, and he asked, should epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, encompass science alone, or science and philosophy, or science, philosophy and theology? And he argued for the latter, science, philosophy and theology. So I'm not going to try to summarise his arguments. I found most of his arguments somewhat unintelligible anyway, because of his theological background. But he did claim that the scientific philosophical demand that every rational belief must be justified by empirical evidence entails an infinite regress that cannot be satisfied. And he claimed that scientism is unscientific. That was his summary. Any comments on that? Does that make sense to you?
It's quite confusing because how can science and religion come together, where science is the ability to reduce to building blocks? And it goes deeper than the scientific method that you showed there. And then religion starts with something whole that you cannot reduce it to any constituent building blocks. So how could you bring them together?
Could he be claiming that this form of science is just a religion itself? Is
that's,
there- I mean,
I think that's
the-
what he is claiming, yeah.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
So,
It's religionism. It's
well,
the equivalent
yeah.
of religionism.
there's an absolute
Scientism.
belief in a truth, isn't there?
But as an apologist, was he claiming that religion? What was his position on religion? And was he saying it was compatible with science, or because you could equally make the comment religion is unscientific?
Yeah, I did go through his talk twice, and I couldn't really extract a great deal out of it. and therefore I'm going to pass on that comment, because to me it didn't make much sense. But then my worldview is completely the opposite. So maybe that's the problem.
He seems to be making quite an assumption about methods of justification. He's assuming a regressive justification system, whereas you don't always have regressive justification. In science you do have different types of justification with nets. You have things that are more to the side and before each other sometimes. I'm describing that for
To me, that struck me, you're talking about the problem of induction.
Yeah.
That's what I thought that he was talking about, but it's not quite that. It's not
I know he's
actually.
assuming a constant regress explanation. This happens, this happens, this happens.
So I'll just read it again. He says that he claims that the scientific philosophical demand, so he's saying that scientism is a philosophy anyway, that every rational belief must be justified by empirical evidence. Well, there I thought, well, that's a straw man. I don't think, perhaps I'm wrong, but does every rational belief have to be justified by empirical evidence? All the way back.
Some things are true by definition.
So anyway, that was his claim. Scientism is unscientific. Right. So this is David Papineau, and he argued that materialism means the world is fully material, and you don't need to go outside physics in the whole universe. And I like to call this worldview of world naturalism, as distinct from supernaturalism. The worldview that the world contains both natural and supernatural elements. And Papineau argues that non-material things cannot exist because they could not interact with the material world. They would be, he calls it epiphenomenal, and would have no effect on anything we know about. And that would include supernatural beings, gods, non-material minds or souls. Any comments on that?
Physical things can have non-material properties, like the property of forms, for example, if I put objects on the table, or the property of squareness, if I want to in a certain way. Those are not material things.
Well, what about the idea of materialism? I mean, being quite narrow there, isn't it? That things that don't actually physically exist. What about freedom? Would he deny that, or would he deny concepts like that, as they are things that are constructed from a different form of materialism, a dialectical materialism, but they are not things that you can actually physically prove? Even in dialectical materialism, they're difficult to prove.
Yeah, many arguments have won and lost on issues about consistency. So that, you can say, well, this belief you hold is not compatible with that belief you hold, therefore you're wrong. That's this is this kind of appeal to logic.
I think
without there being any appeal to any empirical data one way or the other, you just say the things you believe are not compatible with each other, therefore you're wrong.
Perhaps just the word supernatural, I have a real big problem with that. And what people actually mean by it, what scientists would mean by supernatural, and what someone's belief would mean by it. Because within reality, within the universe, something either exists or doesn't exist. And I don't really understand this supernatural state, and I don't understand what a scientist would mean by it. It doesn't seem to have any meaning at all. What does supernatural mean to you? I mean, to me it means nothing. It just means a mystery, a question without evidence. So when atheists and scientists talk about supernatural, often they just mean things they don't believe in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody comment on that?
Well,
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, well, normally when I'm talking about something supernatural, it's something which by its definition cannot be investigated with natural means. It's beyond a natural idea of law. It's beyond a natural idea of freedom. Its very definition means it cannot be identified.
So would you say that the interior of a black hole is supernatural? Or would you say that unobserved universe, which is most of it, is supernatural?
No idea. I think
we will never be able to observe it because it's
I
expanding away
don't
from
know that we'll never be able to observe, or at least understand. And also, we don't need to observe something directly to infer. And to build a large justification on it. But there are some things which are, as defined,
there is a limit
are
to what
unable.
we can experimentally. There is a limit to what can be known.
Yes,
science,
the length
and
of
it's
species.
expanding.
Yeah.
And hopefully it will expand for a long time. But the universe exists beyond that boundary. It's just unexplained at the time.
But we do.
So is that supernatural?
I would have thought so. You say it's unexplained. It's not that it's unexplained.
It's unexplainable. Some things are never going to be explained by science.
It's not. It's not unexplainable. I mean, on theory of inflation.
Okay, I see. There's never going to be any evidence, scientific evidence. It will only ever be
experimental evidence.
Yeah,
Observational evidence.
No observational evidence. But beyond the Big Bang now.
But multiverse theories, they don't come from observation, they come from mathematics.
Sure, and they may be real. No evidence that it's real, just evidence that it's theoretically possible.
But wouldn't it be that they've got a use for supernatural then? If supernatural is a concept that exists purely to define the other, and therefore science can therefore say everything that we do is factually evident, and therefore everything the other does is not factually evident, then surely from that perspective the supernatural is valuable to the scientist to defining who they are as opposed to who they are not.
I just wonder what they really mean when they say it.
It's not me, it's basically supernatural is not me.
Yeah.
Shall I go on and talk a bit about David Papineau's ideas? Because, he says that most things that happen can't be explained by physics, simply because they're too complicated. So some things can't be explained by any quantitative science, but only by appeal to history, politics, and so on. Literature, he says, is often the best way of helping us to understand things better. But that doesn't mean that anything is best explained in some non-scientific way. If something can be explained at all, it's by citing facts that have been established by empirical methods. So the example he gives is the Arab Spring. It couldn't be explained with quantitative models. You need to appeal to history, politics, and psychology. Now he says that, well, it's not perhaps a good definition of how to do science, but it's based on objective empirical evidence. So he says that it's epistemology, the theory of knowledge, which is derived from the Greek word episteme, reading knowledge. He says that epistemology itself needs to be scientifically based. So his conclusion there is that scientism relies on both science and philosophy. And I think probably Atkins, who we'll look at next, was saying that in fact scientism just relies on science and not much on philosophy. So he says that it's an essential complement to science, philosophy. And it's in the same business of developing empirical theories that fit the observational data. But he says that philosophy's specific job is to unravel theoretical tangles that remain even after we have all the data we want. We find tangles inside established scientific disciplines. And there are philosophical puzzles about quantum mechanics and the logic of natural selection. about free will and personal identity. So he says that, well, scientists are trained to do experiments and philosophers are trained to do philosophy. So whilst science can explain everything, it needs the help of philosophy to sort its theories out. That was a comment. I think it sounds to me like he's justifying his job. Slightly, but okay. Any comments on his comments? Yeah.
Doesn't philosophy pose the questions for science in the first place? I think you've got that the wrong way around. It's not philosophy hasn't got a job of explaining science. Philosophy poses the question. That's always been the purpose of philosophy.
Yeah.
Well before anybody even came up with the terminology of science. I mean, the other thing as well, maybe I'm just sort of losing the thread here of the whole conversation really. The question, can science solve every mystery? Well, first of all, what do we mean by mystery? In every mystery, okay, somebody's tried to define it by using words like supernatural. So supernaturals could be a mystery. So, first of all, what mysteries or what supernatural entities does science want to try and solve? For what purpose? And I don't quite understand what science is a tool. Surely scientists go to work, they do things, they try to make the world a better place for us by explaining things. They can get aeroplanes in the sky. They do all these practical things. What does science want to be involved with solving human mysteries for?
Well,
because mysteries are things that come from here.
Right.
And I think somewhere we're missing the point that this is all about interacting with human beings, isn't it? Us clever animals, if you want to just bring it down to the nuts and bolts of it. And we are, by nature, creators of mysteries. That's what we do. We create our own mysteries in I don't quite understand why this suddenly appealed to we need science to fix our mysteries.
Okay.
I'd like someone to answer that
the
question.
engineer's question, make the things happen. Scientists can come up with theories.
Well, maybe after philosophers posed the question and said maybe this is something somebody could come up with. But why does science need to solve all our mysteries? That's my question.
Yeah. I mean, science, scientific methodology, science is a reductionist methodology. The ability to reduce to building blocks. So you have a mystery, if you can reduce that one into its building blocks, then science will come, use the methodology, and try to identify what's the mystery about. But if you cannot reduce that mystery into its building block, either that mystery is a fiction of your imagination, such as religion or supernatural powers or whatever, or you haven't yet defined how you can reduce it to building blocks. So first thing first is reductionism, and then scientific methodology.
The idea of defining it as a mystery, I think, is fantastic for scientists. I think it's a big boost for them. The mystery, obviously being a mystery, will never be solved. So they will always, once you solve it, it's no longer a mystery. So it's that goal that you can always run to. But of course, you will never solve it. If you do solve it, there's another mystery behind it. And it just keeps feeding into the new mystery. So for science, it's great. It's a great
So the
motive.
question, can science solve every mystery? The answer is no then.
No, it can't. But isn't that a great driving force for science?
Why is all these very clever intellectual people discussing a question that
because they might solve
say,
today's
well, no,
mystery, but that will only open up for tomorrow's mystery, and then feed again.
Unfortunately, we live more than 24 hours in our lifetime, don't we? So I don't see where it's taking us.
It's a fascinating question. What I'd quite like to hear, though, are examples of the kinds of mystery that people, opponents say, cannot or could not be answered by science, because people, no doubt, would say things like, what about love? What about why are human beings moved by a piece of art or a piece of music? Things like that. I think many of those I think are.
Yeah, this is exactly what people
scientific method talk about. So I'd like to hear what are the things that people think genuinely cannot or could not be solved by science.
Okay, I'm going to come on to that. In fact, I'm going to come on to the points that we
we think science can solve, and yet many people think that it can't solve. So I'll come on to that. So Peter Atkins' talk was titled "In Praise of Scientism." See where he stands. He says, well, first of all, it's not just a collection of empirical evidence. Science proceeds by collection of evidence based on carefully controlled observations, experiments, and the evidence should be inserted into a matrix of ideas. So science is enhanced in the overlapping regions of study, unlike religion, where they are often in conflict, says Peter. So biology thrives from chemistry and physics, and the large-scale structure of the universe is instructed by the small-scale subatomic particles. And he says that humanity should be proud to have stumbled upon over the last 6 centuries this really rather obvious way of acquiring reliable knowledge. And so this is something I built from Wikipedia this morning, which I think is quite nice, showing the overlapping parts of scientific disciplines. So, for example, biochemistry, chemistry, physics, so on. He has got a bee in his bonnet about why questions. He says that why questions do not lead to a reliable knowledge. They should always be deconstructed into how questions. So why is the sky blue can be rephrased as how does it come about that the sky is blue? Science can't currently answer every great question of importance to mankind. It's better to seek answers in the scientific mode than any other mode. And he uses an analogue of scientists to describe himself. So scientism has an analogue of scientists, and he calls it a scientismist. So he says, I'm a scientismist. And he says that the profound issues are, he's got a list of his profound issues. And, so the first one, well, ethics. Can science illuminate ethics? How does a scientismist approach the question about torture of children and other matters of ethics? You could look at a holy book and seek a theological interpretation, or you could look at ethology, which is the scientific study of animal behaviour, or anthropology. And he sort of basically said, well, why is it better to follow some ancient authority to understand modern human behaviour? Surely, he says, it's better to look at the roots of behaviour and reflect on that than lie supine, that's my word, and accept authority to tell you all the answers. So he's really having a dig there, I think, at holy books. So that was one thing that he says is a profound issue that can indeed be asked by science. Emotion is another one. And it just says, a scientist would say, to understand all the emotions, including love and hate and so on, you could look into the psychology and the physiology of these hormones and so on. But he's got a real big thing for the afterlife, and he says the most evil aspect of religious understanding of the world, according to Atkins, is that the afterlife. The scientism simply denies existence of any afterlife. You can have immortality, like Mozart through music and Tutankhamun through tourism, but anything that accepts continuation of self can be denied by science. But his science theology would say, in a shell of its own making, science cannot have evidence of anything outside the physical realm. Well, Atkins says that's complete nonsense, and I tend to agree with him. There is not one jot of evidence for an afterlife. The concept of afterlife allows religious people to impose power by, for example, fear of damnation in an afterlife. And it quenches human aspiration because there is no need to try in this life, as in the afterlife you'll have a better deal. So it encourages martyrs to end their lives, almost to meet their 70 virgins.
It's an empirical question then, isn't it? I mean, religion might do us good, it might not do us good. It's an empirical question, it's an open empirical question.
Yeah, but is it true?
Well, no,
Whether it makes us happy.
Those are saying it's not true. We sometimes fall into saying it's not true and it also doesn't do us good. It's not this type of argument. It might not be true, but it might do us good. Whether it does us good or not, it's an open empirical question. And that's, in a sense, a question of social science, isn't it?
Can I just ask him, why would a scientist be interested in the afterlife? What purpose is it just...
I think he just feels that it is, he says it's an evil aspect. An evil aspect of the world.
From what I'm thinking of, if you take it from the idea that, say that, if you take it from the Adorno idea, say that science was responsible for a certain amount of evil in the world, then couldn't the discussion of the afterlife be another concept of pushing out to the other? Oh, religion does the nasty things, religion is nasty, and it's almost a denial, so they have to actually talk about this idea of almost bring it into their own discourse in order to be able to project it out onto somebody else to relieve their own guilt of what has gone on in the name of science. I mean, I'm taking a sort of extending that out a bit. But I mean, could that be it? Because they've got no reason to discuss the afterlife.
That's nonsense, though.
Scientifically.
Well, why wouldn't you be interested in it? You know, there's all sorts of great evidence of the afterlife. There's reincarnation, there's ghosts, there's near-death experience, there's mediumship.
But
when you read a book like The Science of Life, published in the 30s, Wells and Huxley, it's got chapters at the end on material mediumship. Well, you know, if it's true, that's an interesting scientific fact about the universe, that there's something about human consciousness that survived bodily dissolution. Why the hell would we be interested in that?
Well, I'm thinking from a Sartre point of view, if there is nothing after this, then why not just be happy with nothing? Why not just be content with saying it's nothing?
That's taking the position there is nothing.
Once upon a time, I might have said, look, there's nothing after the horizon, so what's the point of going and having a look? That's the point. That's why science wants to look at these things, because you go, somebody's saying there's an afterlife, and well, I'd like to know about that if it's true. So you try and test, and if you can't test, you don't really worry about it.
But you're adopting the language of religion.
No,
you're
I'm
adopting
testing their proposition. I'm applying reason to their proposition that there is an afterlife.
Yeah, but will you scientifically use science to be able to say that's right and wrong? Because if you can't, you're just using their language.
Well, yeah, I have to use the language of the
Might as
person
well
who's
get science to
proposing
look for
the
witches
concept.
as well then while you're at it.
So look for witches. Yeah, they do.
Yeah,
we
it's
just,
fine.
I mean, it's just
Neil?
I'm echoing what Fred's saying. I mean, scientists talk about it because it's a claim being made. It's no different from like creationism. It's a claim that's being made.
And I think he's wrong to say there's no evidence. I think it's better to say there's no good evidence.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, he's quite insistent that there is not even a jot of evidence.
But that's nonsense.
It's just what the gentleman over there said. It's
Yeah.
a mystery.
Yeah.
Why not investigate mysteries? That's what we're here to do.
If you have resources.
yeah.
There are so many burning questions.
But,
I'd rather science go on.
can we
I've got some
start-
drinking water for the
What I'd
planet.
like to move on to, if I may, is some of the other aspects he's talking about. And I think you really will find it really interesting is talk about origins as well. And he will be talking about he briefly mentions consciousness, but he also talks about the origin of the cosmos. And these he says, are the profound issues. The origin of life. And because he's a physical chemist, how did the physical laws come into existence? And so in the last, I guess, really we want to finish up at 9. I'd like to look at these three aspects of life, if I may. So he says, can science illuminate consciousness? In other words, a sense of self-awareness. Consciousness will be simulated by computation, so that one day a computer will be terrified that its maker will turn it off. You will then be able to explore all the attributes of consciousness, including aesthetic appreciation. Now, often says a computer might evolve differently from us. Sure it will. It might like the look of a woman who looks like a grey box rather than ours. Which I thought was rather nice.
How do you ever know that the computer is terrified as opposed to just programming it to scream every time it saw its owner go towards it?
I don't know. Anyway, that was his take on consciousness. So his last bits were on origins. These other profound issues. So the origin of the cosmos. He says that accepting that there was a prime mover of God who made everything, he says, is intellectual laziness. How did absolutely nothing, by that he means void, not even a vacuum, turn itself into everything? The origin of the cosmos. And he says science is edging extraordinarily carefully to this understanding. It's the tortoise, the theological hare, who says God did it. The tortoise of science accumulates evidence from cosmology and fundamental particles so that it moves back towards the origin. And the beginning of the universe is coming into view of science. So he also talks about the origin of life, and indeed at the Leeds talk that I went to, there was a whole talk about the inorganic origin of life. So he says, how did the inorganic tumble into the organic? Did it require the touch of a divine finger? Or can the inorganic become the organic? Can life emerge from the absence of it? There are dozens of theories. Scientists don't know which, if any, are true. Many speculate about the nature of clay and the ground and the atmosphere. But he says that there's no reason for divine presence to account for the change from the inorganic to the organic. And science will eventually work it out. And finally, he talks about how did the physical laws come into existence. Now in this debate he spent 15 minutes. So what he says is the conservation of energy says that you can't create or destroy energy. You can only change the type of energy. Whatever amount of energy at the beginning of the universe will have at the end. Without conservation of energy, causality, which by that he means one event leads to another and to another, would collapse and science would vanish. If time is uniform, then energy is conserved. So by that he means it goes tick, 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 tick. That's what he means by uniform. But if time is not uniform, in other words, it went tick, 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 energy would not be conserved, so causality would vanish and science would be gone. And then he also looks at the conservation of linear momentum. You know, when billiard balls bounce off each other, that relies on the linearity of space. So he's saying that, well, this is my reading of it, it might be wrong. He's saying that time and space are uniform. And then he poses the question, well, what was there before the beginning of the universe? He said, well, there was nothing. And nothing is uniform. If it wasn't uniform, it wouldn't be nothing. So nothing has to be uniform. Suppose nothing at all happened at the creation. Then that uniformity of absolutely nothing became the absolute uniformity of space-time. Hence conservation of energy and linear momentum. And he says it's natural that they should be there. Now, I haven't done justice to his argument. And he spent 15 minutes on it, I just spent 2 minutes. He said that, does God make sure that light travels in straight lines? Light could conceivably travel in all sorts of paths, but there are troughs and peaks of light rays that all cancel out. Only the straight line path of light does not have troughs and peaks cancelling out. So he says, finally, that the physical laws sprang from nothing, and the ones that didn't spring from nothing sprang from anarchy. Well, I don't fully understand it. But it's intriguing to me anyway. So if that whets your appetite for more, please listen to Atkins on YouTube. Finally, as Peter Atkins said in his book on Unbeing, the approach, making observation and comparing notes, will forever survive as the only way of acquiring reliable knowledge. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
I think it's fair to say, Atkins has been going on like this for some time. He wrote a book called The Creation, and then Creation Revisited in the 80s. And there are different types of theories then, and I don't think many people have followed him in his trying to get from nothing to something. I mean, he's pretty much out on a limb. It's quite spectacular.
It is, I agree, and Lawrence Krauss, of course, has also got a book on the same subject.
Yes.
And I have to say, I have read it a couple of times, and I don't understand it.
I think it's very fair to ask whether you kind of doing a commentary on what other people think, or whether or not you want to defend a scientist's position.
I think probably I'm with David Patterney more than I'm with Atkins, because I think there is a place for history, politics, and so on, not just taking science as the crux of everything that's important. I tend to want to take Peter Atkins' position.
But I can see what you're saying. If you say, well, we learn things from history, aren't we learning things in a kind of scientific way that we observe repeatedly that a nation is oppressed, certain things will happen, and we see that over and over again. Therefore, we form a view that
was very insistent that he was talking about historical things that are based on observation.
So isn't that observational and replicability and so on, that's a scientific method?
The non-reductions.
Sorry?
But non-reductions.
One problem that I have with that position is that history, culture, and philosophy is full of weeds. Ideas are there, not useful, dead, but still they live. In science, we keep selecting and moving on and throwing out ideas or methodologies that are not useful or dangerous.
I think that's right. Eventually, the word there is eventually, truth will come out, but it takes many decades.
But the problem is that you've got to be too patient with that position. I would prefer Atkins' position to lead out.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Mr. Chairman, when everybody else is finished, could I have 2 minutes to make an appeal? Chris is agreeing as well. Just a very quick appeal.
When you say an appeal,
I've got to get the chairman's permission first. Is that all right? Just
You want to do it now?
well, when everyone else is finished.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much. It's quite simply, I take a completely different view from Chris. Absolutely. I was a science teacher 30 years, from 11 to 18. And my approach is completely, and there's no room enough for every approach. Absolutely.
It is your slide.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. I did ask Chris to put 2 slides on. and we're looking around to see if anyone is actually doing science. Because science is something you do. Of course you've got to talk about it. And of course, unfortunately, we've got to use words. I mean, there are about 50 words which are spoken this evening, which have to be defined. And not defined forever, but in ways that get the argument a bit further forward, that's all. So my approach is from 11-year-old. But believe me, I'm thinking more and more that everybody needs to appreciate science more. First of all, I think an approach of treating everybody as a scientist of varying amounts of ability in science is one approach, which we would like to try out. And that's what I want to try and do. As a teacher, I got to about this stage. Are these the words of science or not? Are there some words in there? Okay. Well, let's explain it to people. What is science? It's actually a series of processes which you recycle and recycle and recycle until you get somewhere useful. I'm beginning to talk too much. And my appeal, I mean, I came along to support Chris. I came along to see what response he got, and I'm very, very grateful to you all for that. But my appeal is, I want to show people in 2 minutes flat what science really is. And I was going to appeal, if there's anybody really interested in science who is a programmer, I'd be very, very pleased if they contacted me, because my programming skills are zero. But you can use the ideas and the visual ideas of what science processes are to get that point across. This is science, look at it, it's going quickly. And you keep going until you get an answer. And then you get people to do science and talk about themselves solving problems. Unless we get more people solving problems for themselves, that's what the government is asking, isn't it? And that's what I think is wrong with science education. In science education, we've done everybody else's science, a very little bit of our own science. And yet, in everyday life, we do use it. You know, and you want to know what science is, you go and put a baby on the floor and see it explore a new toy. That's what science is. It doesn't have to be told. You know. So you can see how my approach is, but the appeal is very simply, and I'll stop now, is anybody who's interested in programming and science and wants to help change humanism to look at science more seriously. Just give your chair a name or...
Go on the next slide.
It's at the next stage in my thinking, if you just put it on.
Yeah.
Because, you know...
Okay, that was...
Would anybody like to draw a conclusion? I've never done this experiment before. Are they the same words? Do I have to go on asking questions? Are you asking questions? You know, please ask a question. I may not be able to answer it.
I have actually an answer and a question at the same time. You said that you want to stimulate the thinking about doing science.
Yes.
Are you aware, and you said that your programming skills are not as such, are you aware that there is quite a strong group of young scientists working very hard on their own, moving away from traditional science as it's done? And they're called biohackers.
Biohazards.
Hackers. Biohackers.
Biohackers.
They are
actually
using, and it is quite a strong, it actually is an answer to your question. It is already happening. We might need to research further on the work they're doing. And the only reason I am referring to that is I am the mother of a biohacker. who has his own laboratory in California. And they bring citizen scientists together that are interested in solving problems that pharmaceutical companies will not take on board. They will take it on and work on it together. And they are coming up with answers to the question. So the movement already exists. And I think the young people are showing us the way.
Would your marvellous son be interested in humanism?
Yes, he's actually a humanist.
Absolutely. That's what I want. Humanists for Science is about the overlap between humanism and science. I think that humanism's got such a lot to give to science, and vice versa. Not least explaining why so many scientists are believers. There may be some in the audience tonight, because I don't know. It's quite interesting that we've got philosophers and scientists and humanists here. So not knowing is a good starting point for science. I didn't know when I convened Humanists for Science where it was going. To be honest, I still don't. That's right, isn't it, Chris?
We have many discussions.
Lots of discussion. Chris might mind me saying this because he's the person who got through this experiment best. We decided there was it was cheaper to go on Skype than go on telephone to have teleconferences. Anybody familiar with Skype? I'm sure you are. Mm-hmm. And we threw out, didn't we, Chris, an invitation for 6 people who were in the science group to do a science conference. You know, Skype has just got to conferencing, hasn't it, I believe. And Chris and I were the only ones who really got there, so we had to abandon that experiment.
But having said that, the atheists in the group that I'm a member of, they use Skype, no problem at all.
Absolutely. It is possible, isn't it? But you've got to want to get talking with each other. And so talking is important in science, but it's more important to actually do some before you start criticising.
You said early on that you've been an atheist for a long time,
yeah.
And you've recently discovered humanism.
Yeah.
Can you tell us something about that discovery? What it meant to you as an atheist to discover humanism?
I think, well, it was, how I came about it was actually I started blogging around about when I was 50, and I suddenly came across this other kind of philosophy out there that I'd never really come across until then. And it just sort of felt that whilst I was an atheist, but humanism had so much more. And so it was really my worldview, I guess. It was actually mirrored what my worldview
how does humanism differ from atheism? What does it add to atheism?
Oh gosh, that's a big question.
Well, I mean, I would have thought it was a pretty kind of obvious question.
It's a standard one, but okay, there are lots of, you can have a long list of what humanists believe, but for example, one thing is that we believe we can be good without God. Okay. And another thing is that
do atheists believe that?
Not necessarily, no. And the other thing is that we sort of emphasise the fact that this is one life, and we're going to make the best of it. But I suggest you have a look at the British Humanists Association website, and you'll learn a lot more about it.
No, I'm just interested in individual experience. I have some awareness of what's going on.
Yes.
Just following on from that question, then, as a youngster growing up, did you kind of consider yourself having this label as I am an atheist? Did you sort of go around and say, by the way, I'm an atheist? So it wasn't anything you'd ever really thought of?
No, I don't think.
And then at some stage you decided that you wanted to be part of a group of people who thought like you did, who had similar beliefs, that we can be good people without religious doctrine. Is that sort of, does that sum it up a little bit in a way?
Yeah.
But did you felt somehow you felt a need to cling to other people who had a similar thought, or you wanted to be in a group like the humanists do? They want to be together rather than. I just wonder why people who don't have any belief can just not go through without being concerned about what other people's beliefs are. That's how I feel personally. I mean, I haven't got any. I don't have any what we might call supernatural beliefs. I don't feel the desire or the need for it. But I don't really feel I need to concern myself with what somebody else's beliefs are, unless they're directly affecting me or being in a position on my life or within my society. So I just wonder why this thing of, you know, get together as a group, it kind of makes me think there's a desire to kind of, I don't know, make a presence, feel a presence of a group there. You know, I don't know. I just wonder maybe if you could elaborate on it.
A lot of the time one spends online, but it's nice to meet up with people.
Yeah, a bit like a person who's got a religious belief sits at home on their own all the time, but they perhaps think maybe I should go along on a Sunday morning with some other like-minded people.
I mean, you might like to ask some of the other humanists here. Swindon.
Yeah, they have spoken about it before.
I completely agree with what you said. That people are free to have their beliefs. I'm not concerned about what people believe unless it impinges on my life in some way. But then the people who have those beliefs are incredibly well organised. Getting their beliefs put out there and affecting other people's lives. And so I think humanism and the BHA are there to organise a response to that.
To be an association to say we haven't got any beliefs.
Well, no, to say it's not necessarily those beliefs, but that those beliefs should have any more say than any other belief, or no. Because they do.
Promote the idea that, you know, you don't have to have any belief in.
That's one target for sure.
And give people a voice.
But for example, the number of bishops that are in the House of Lords, that's because of as a religious thing.
So straight away there's a political edge there.
This idea of it's an idea of one. I mean, as a scientist, a social scientist, I am. It's an idea. Everybody wants to belong to something. They want to be able to engage with people of like-minded views, whether that's in a religion or whether that's in a group of friends. It's just a natural thing that people like to do. Yeah, you know, and so you know. The God thing's nothing to do with it really, because the religion is just like-minded people getting together.
Sure.
But other groups and clubs and groups like that, it's just like-minded people coming together. It's a huge strength for people. It's a strength for us all.
Yeah, well, I agree. I'm just confirming that it's the same as the religious groups that go along together. You're looking for some kind of succour in a society with like-minded people.
A lot of people would make that claim that it's just a religion now.
It's an interesting contrast.
That's all it takes to everybody on the planet.
Perhaps we should just tell everybody who obviously are not familiar with the convention, but what we normally do, if we want to speak, we put our hands up, and the chairman points to you and allows you to speak, and then people don't interrupt you.
We're a little less informal.
Well, that's the kind of normal meeting format, but I've now completely forgotten what I wanted to say.
We'll move on then.
What I was going to say was that there's an interesting contrast between what's been described in terms of humanists about the philosophy of society, because the last thing you could say about us is that we all think the same. There are serious, emotional eyeball confrontation that go on here. And there is by no means any kind of agreement. It's not a gathering together, in the warmth against the cold outside.
I'm just going to say, I wonder whether whether you're a humanist or an atheist or a Catholic or Christian, is people wanting to have some articulate an identification as well as belonging, different to belonging, but sort of a self-identity, and articulating who they are, do you know what I mean? Rather than belonging to a group.
Yeah, but that's how they form their identity, is by belonging as well. It can help strengthen their identity.
But I'm thinking that that's sort of something separate than belonging to a group, which is identifying yourself, do you know what I mean?
So I just wanted to say to our friend over there, that in the Humanists for Science group, we did have a discussion very early on about whether social science was indeed a science, and I think we said it was. That's it.
Well, thank you. You've legitimated me.
I would describe myself an atheist and a humanist as well, and I wouldn't see any conflict between them. I wonder if you see any conflict between your atheism and humanism.
going. I formed a club a few years ago called the Hasms, and that stands for Humanist, Atheist, Scientific, Secularist, Naturalistic, Evolutionary, Rationalist Skeptic. And so I guess I'm partly all of those, and a lot of other people are as well. Not that we have anything. But yeah.
I would like to say that Chris has put a very great deal into the Humanists for Science, and as you just heard, he's very active on the blogging sphere. I think you said, Chris, you've got 30 blogs?
Yeah, but
not all in sight.
They're not active.
The mind.
What I alluded to before, I'm concerned about the way in which you can, someone like Dawkins and others, can slip from saying that religion is just not true into saying religion does more harm than good. And so you have a kind of, now of course it's a very, very different claim. And it's a social science claim, it's an investigable, empirical question, and it's by no means clear which way it goes there. And another kind of way of looking at it, as I would think, is to say it depends on what kind of religions you're looking at. And actually, I would say you'll probably belong to the side of the kind of liberal theology. You'll probably go liberal theology, but it does more good than harm. but what I'm saying is, it does genuinely trouble me. So, when you were doing your talk, and you were describing some position, and there was just a kind of 30-second vilification of religion and its effects, which is given out by someone like Dawkins and others, without respect, in a sense, for the social science, and with research, it's just asserted. And it might be wrong. It may be true that religion, actually, a particularly liberal kind of religion, which stresses equality and consideration for others and kindness or whatever, a kind of universal love kind of religion, does some good. It may be true.
Can I just... I have some personal experience on this debate, because I was very privileged to be asked to be the first speaker at the Cambridge Union Society last month. And their motion was, this House believes that the Catholic Church is a force for good. That was the motion I was opposing. And I'm glad to say that the noes won by 85 to the ayes 82. Margin of 3.
You occasionally hear about deathbed conversions in Protestantism, and so forth. Have you ever, as a humanist, heard of any deathbed conversions from humanism? Thought a lot in the last
Well, I think Anthony Flew was a very well-known atheist. Whether he's a humanist, I'm not sure. But certainly, it's claimed that he did convert to Christianity.
No, just some vague idea that there might be some sort of design of it.
Maybe it was a more pantheist type of idea. I don't know.
It wasn't definitely, I'm still
But it was quite late on in his...
But it's one of the Calvinist original trailers. Somebody's actually written a book on all the claims from Darwin, for example. There's a story that some maid comes in and they say something says, I threw it on the fire, so the dollars have done duty travel. This, and it's all.
But just a final point. Is it important to actually define yourself as an atheist? I'm thinking about when even in religion of years ago, they never spoke of God. They were in monasteries. They took vow of silences, and they never spoke the word of God, or they never spoke about God. And it was often, even in sort of Hobbes's day, you wouldn't, and they would always say that the true atheist never admits they're an atheist. So is it a kind of language that exists that you can be an atheist but not declare it? Do you think that's acceptable? Do you think that's okay?
It's okay. Depends on the circumstance.
What I'm saying is, if science can't answer the idea of God, then just leave God. Then just leave that to one side and just do the science.
It's the made of third edition of these scientists. There's an article about religion, and they define 4 different types of atheists, including the sort of the one that just doesn't get it, that's basically autistic. It seems a deficit from that. But he says, what's gaining ground
Yes, it's the numbers, as it were. Yes, it's the apathy vote. So in America, perhaps there's only, I think, 5% who actually declare themselves as atheists, or even as atheists and agnostic. But there's another 15%, so a total of 20%, that basically say, well, we don't really do religion.
And that's what came out, of course, out of the latest ONS survey of religion, where great shock and horror, the rising number of people of the Islamic faith in the UK, but nowhere near the growth of atheism and no religion.
That's right. Paul, I was looking at a list of the countries that were most religious and the countries which were least. And I was thinking, would you rather live in Norway or in Nigeria, which is second in the list? Would you rather live in Denmark, or Iran? It seems to me that very often highly religious countries. And you can see why. It's not just, but it's not necessarily
rich in 4 countries.
It's
got to compare rich and rich countries.
Well, how about Saudi Arabia and Norway then?
Not a liberal religion.
When you're looking at the things which cause a decline in the number of people who claim to be religious, it's stuff like welfare. Where you have poverty, where you have warfare, internal warfare, where you have catastrophe, religion thrives. And you can see why, because it gives people a little bit of hope. But where you have reliable welfare mixed with a bit of insurance, then religion seems to fail.
One of the things we touched on just in this discussion about the difference between religion and science, let's say, is the truth clause. And it seems to me that scientists have said it's very important. You're going to do all these experiments because you want to find something out. And actually, it is quite important to know if this drug cures malaria or it doesn't before we know what's producing it. In my experience, it seems that a lot of religious people, whether it's the faith thing or not, they don't seem so concerned about the fact that whether or not it's true is that important.
Yes, it reminds me of a debate we had at Dorset Humanists about did Jesus basically resurrect? And apparently, in the first kind of couple of years, they didn't actually look at the facts of it. It was a position of faith, and that they took it as a given that he did. So that's the only thing that struck me when you said that. But
I always think that whenever anyone says that there's good scientific evidence for the resurrection, that's done with the Peter theologian in that discussion.
Peter Williams, yeah.
Peter Williams claims there's good evidence. My answer always is yes, I know that because my neighbour resurrected. And then I want to know what they want from me to prove that my neighbour resurrected, and then compare that with what we've got, 2,000-year-old documents and hearsay and contradiction. It seems a strange position for someone as clever as Peter Williams to claim that the evidence is overwhelming.
It was another debate we had last month with Dorset Humanists, where on one side we have Morelands College, which is a Bible college.
I can't believe this was a productive week.
It was fascinating. It was fascinating.
Not very related to the ongoing discussion, but just came to my mind, so I haven't thought of it. Could we call those who literally believe that Jesus is my background was when Muhammad went to the seventh sky as a liar? Could we call them a liar? Because when they literally believe in it, we scientifically see that, for instance, there is a seventh sky.
Well, normally when you call someone a liar, you presume intent. Otherwise, you just say they're mistaken. It's a bit unkind to call someone a liar who genuinely thinks that.
Okay, ordinary people maybe you would be unkind, but those who are treating it literally, depending their position. You could have gone
Just on that point, I think Daniel Dennett and some other philosophers did a program where they interviewed lots of preachers, vicars, religious people like that who lost their belief, don't have that faith anymore, yet still carry on with their job and do their sermons and everything. And that instance, maybe I wouldn't necessarily call them liars either, but then getting closer to it than just not having a belief.
It's interesting that if someone goes to a solicitor's to swear an oath, the first thing they're given is a Bible. So it's given to be a sign of the truth that you believe in.
But you don't have to. You don't have to. You can affirm. It's one of the things, we're in a Quaker meeting house here. The Quakers would never give oaths, and they were regarded at first as being completely untrustworthy. They wouldn't give oaths, and after a while it worked in their favour that these people were suffering, imprisonment and in some cases torture, and yet they proved to be quite upright, and yet their principles were that they wouldn't take an oath, and it actually worked in their favour in the long run. They were more honest than people who take oaths.
We had this kind of Swindon humanist meeting, which was interesting. It was good. I'm kind of thinking, well, what are the positive beliefs? Is there any kind of consensus here about positive beliefs? It's kind of brings back to what Chris was saying, but I think you kind of alluded to the idea that generally we can. There's kind of what is that positive belief? Some kind of capacity for goodness. We can be, we can do good without religion. It was a struggle, So, is it the argument from Gray, for example, the kind of straw dogs and so on? Is it humanists do believe in something? They have a kind of quasi-religious belief, John Gray says, and a quasi-religious belief is belief in human progress. So we can move towards a better world, we're on some journey together. And of course, that's John Gray's argument: is that this is a substitute religion without the insight into the human condition. But but on the other hand, it was rejected. I think
a lot of humanists do take great exception.
I think they would,
So there's a lot.
But you come back to this positive belief. I mean, what is the positive moral belief? There are positive ethical beliefs that you would say bring together humans.
Treat everybody the same.
And that's the golden rule. It's one.
And the freedom of belief, so every human is allowed to believe whatever they want. That's part of being human. So having the freedom is part of what makes it great.
Right, this goes on with all. Very good. That's good.
Try reading Jean-Paul Sartre. I think he comes out with a good answer for that.
Which is?
Well, just finding your own way in an existentialist kind of fashion. Finding your own systems of right and wrong don't depend on references that have been handed down for many years. Go out and seek your own truth. And it could be from science.
I think the golden rule is quite key for us. There are lots of different ways of describing the golden rule, but I think that it's don't do to somebody else what you wouldn't want to be done to you. It's a silver rule.
I got this from a philosopher. I got this from a philosopher, and that was get rid of uncertainty in your life. And I think science does that. And I know not many people would believe that, but I think it actually does.
Gets rid of uncertainty.
Absolutely. If you want to be positive about life, just take out the uncertainty. Well, you can do lots of it by just not worrying about things which you never going to answer.
But if you believe in sort of preparing view of science, you believe that everything that science now holds to be certain will one day be replaced by something different. In the way that Newtonian gravity is replaced by Einstein's general relativity.
Does anyone here watch QI? Did you see the program where he said, but they've actually plotted a graph, but the way in which what they put across as facts on QI changes over time. You know, there's a very vast proportion of things in the early programs are now not facts. I mean, Stephen's got his little card for facts, and we're all impressed. But now they've got to alter it. And if you saw that program, they're actually awarding points for people who said it's wrong, and Stephen was saying it's right. But they're giving them points back.
How does that give you more certainty?
Well, that's it. You know, I think science will increase certainty if we ask the right questions. I mean, in this respect, we're like religions. Religions are told not to ask too much for God, aren't they?
Somebody needs to quote Karl Popper's, don't they, about how very easy it is to be wrong, but absolutely impossible to know that you can be certain that you're right.
Absolutely, yeah.
I was going to say almost the same thing, that just talking about Newtonian gravity, not like working out like Newton thought things worked out. That's a very good model, using that data available, using those tools available. And yeah, we've refined the model, we've refined the theory. It does. I don't think it makes Newton's ideas less true. It's just we're looking from a different perspective now. An increased perspective based on better knowledge. So, yeah, those things are still true, even though they're a bit off.
When one scientific theory faces another, if it's going to be successful, if it explains everything the old theory did, and some new facts. But you know, sometimes it completely throws out the framework of Newtonian gravity. So to say that if Newtonian gravity had been preserved, it might be used as a rule of thumb. Yeah. But exactly in terms of
it's accurate at a level it's used.
But it's not forces between the massive bodies anymore.
No. But I agree.
But it doesn't mean predictions of Newton's theory will be wrong.
Well, some of them
beyond a certain levels.
Much as like, I mean, I like the idea that, you know, a golden rule of some description is important for humanists. And, you know, there is a sense of, where does it come from? You know, in the sense of, because it really does sound like an article of faith. It's an article of faith. I like, I approval. It's a good thing, you know, a decent God would say such a thing. You know. But the question is, it's not self-evidently true, as you might say. You should treat others as you would hope to be treated yourself. You know, it's
it seems to have arisen in every single culture around the world, doesn't it?
It's interesting the idea that atheists and humanists can be good without God. You know, people seem to think really that that's somehow wrong. But what's Confucius? You know, Confucius has the golden rule. I mean, it's what 2,500 years old. It's not a religion.
The VHA got a huge A3 poster of all the different golden rule definitions in each of the religions and philosophies, including Confucianism and so on.
I just wanted to ask, does it matter if it's not self-evidently true? Does it matter that you might have to actually spend some effort and find it out?
You're assuming it's true. You can find it out. You're assuming there's a truth there.
But it might not be self-evident. I'm just wondering why it's important for it to be self-evident.
How would you find it?
But I want to say, you know, it's an answer to scientism, isn't it? It's an answer to scientism. Here we have something we believe we hold to be true, we hold to be important, that's not in any sense from science.
Not without some.
We don't always have to accept something as true. We don't have to prove something, make it self-evident to accept it as true. Sometimes we're just left without any other options. There is no way for you to justify not treating people equally, or with equal consideration. I'd like to sometimes, but there's no way for me to justify that. So I don't.
Well, people have justified it, of course.
They've tried. I don't think they've done it successfully.
You know, all sorts of press groups have been involved in having less status, not having equal status.
Yeah, but
so it's a relatively modern notion that we all have equal value.
Maybe.
I was going to say that it does seem as though the humanist thing does come a lot from the Nietzsche idea, doesn't it? Just to re-evaluate values, isn't it? The idea that you can have these values that have, say, been handed down for, 2,000 years or whatever, but the idea you chuck them away reevaluate them. But as Nietzsche would say, you'll come along with the same kind of ideas. Don't kill people, don't hurt people, and all the same kind of moral ideas, but you find them out yourself. And and that seems to be what I think is the heart of humanism when you ask about the moral perspective of where it comes from. So it is very Nietzschean in its foundation, I would thought.
If we're kind of fizzling out, I wonder if I would just ask that question again, if there are people in the audience who think there are things which, specific things which they think science cannot, will never be able to answer. Let's see, are there any of those?
I think it's the old distinction. Science is really the domain of what is the case, and what ought to be the case. I can't see how science can answer that without bringing in some assumptions. Now, the assumptions might be obvious to everyone. There might be some version of the Golden Rule or Sam Harris's human welfare, but they are assumptions. And I think we have to recognise that they're not derived from something.
Just from reading up about, we were talking about earlier on the origins of life, and we were saying there's a lot of theories about how life arose on this planet. One of the things about that is the evidence of what actually happened has been wiped out. We'll never actually find evidence to prove one way or another the process that happened. We may well come up with a model that works, or several models that work, but that's all we'll be able to do. We won't be able to actually say this is how it happened.
So that might be something that science cannot ever.
I mean, we might be able to, but it might be possible that we'll never be able to actually determine one way or the other.
But we're finding, for example, older rocks now, and we're finding rocks now that are as old as life on Earth, and they may contain evidence for what actually happened in those days, and we may be able to simulate similar things in the labs and work out the concentration of chemicals you'd expect to find in the rock. And there's ways in which you can do that.
And that wouldn't necessarily be how it happened.
That's always true in science.
That's what I'm saying, something that will never actually.
No set of facts determines a scientific theory. They're always an element of conventional hypotheses.
But would it be terrible?
What happens? You see evidence is coming from different corners, and then they emerge and give the same or similar story, and then you start feeling that okay, maybe you have better model, you have better theory, but it's not too much out, even though the origin has been
one of the best scientific theories for that slow accumulation of predictions, in fact, is Newtonian gravity. Precisely, almost the best you can come up with the confirmation in terms of you discover new planets by looking where the calculations say you ought to look. That you never guarantee that the whole thing is not going to be replaced by something different.
But can I come? When quantum mechanics emerges, still the body of the information that has been accumulated through quantum mechanics is still there, but within a certain resolution. It is everything is a matter of resolution, and knowledge has got its resolution, and we keep refining it every day.
I think in answer to Jerry's question, I think there's a lot of things that science cannot answer and probably never will be able to answer. To bring it back to a human perspective, a lot of people in the world choose to believe that they're going to live forever. They cannot cope with their non-existence when their body clocks out. Now, how does science explain why people choose to hang on to that belief? There's something innate in our species, not in all of us, whether we want to call ourselves humanists or atheists or whatever label we want to stick on. Some people want to hang on to that, they want to believe that. Now, can science ever explain why some human beings try to hang on to that?
They could come up with some pretty plausible explanations. Once a creature gets clever enough to realise it's going to die, it's got all sorts of psychic.
Okay, so if science did ever discover what causes people to want to pretend they're going to live forever in another sphere, what we're going to try and find a way of eradicating that then? Is that, you know, do you think science perhaps could do that? That way we could kill off any kind of religious beliefs completely, couldn't we? You know? I'm not quite sure how, you know, what we're trying to model here, really, what we're trying to mould, I should say, rather than model, you know.
Can I just answer that question and answer the other question? First of all, it's just a matter of just being happy with knowing that there's nothing after this. I mean,
because some people are happy thinking there is.
No, but what I'm saying is, before you were born, you were nothing. You're going to return back to that nothing. So why be frightened about it? You're just going back to your original state.
Well, I
you know, why not be comfortable
I
with
agree
that?
with exactly what you're saying, and I personally, I've brought that. I'm of that position.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to say, why is it for us or scientists to go around trying to keep telling people who are happy and living good lives? We've got to quash that belief. What's the point of it?
I don't think
what's the point? What's the point in trying to quash that belief? I'm trying to understand why we have to wash that away from people who are happy thinking with that.
I was going to answer the question that was originally asked.
Oh, you said they do.
Okay, Ian's going to tell us what
the question that was originally asked, which was,
what counts science?
Oh yeah, science, could it answer all the questions? I hope it can't, because if it can, I think we would generally become quite lazy, because we would think, well, the answer's going to come about at some point. It's a good motivator to make us think that we're always going to be learning something. We'll learn something else. We've got something. We can constantly move on from the position we get to. And science, as you said at the beginning, didn't you? It's about hypothesis, testing it, moving on, new hypothesis. So surely science doesn't want to answer every question.
Well, don't you think dreams are the final theory?
Can I come to that? Basically, the more resolution becomes final, the more we are approaching chaotic behavior. At a very fine resolutions, normally it's chaotic. It's only at higher, not higher resolution, at higher levels and lower resolution that if there are behaviors, then they seem cause and effect. For instance, fluid flows. You have laminar flow, turbulent flow, you can model all those, but as you go to finer and finer resolution, then it's chaotic. This is the same everywhere, but when you get to that very fine resolution, which is chaotic, you know it's chaotic, but you have a better knowledge, so you are not lost. You may have a lot of different questions, but you are a better person to see this than just having a knowledge limited, for instance, to laminar flow. There, everything is certain. So,
Neil, I'm going to give you the last.
Well, I was just reminded of a quote by the comedian Dara Bree, who said when people come up to him and say, well, science doesn't know everything, he would always reply, well, obviously science doesn't know everything, because if it did, it would stop.
Okay, well, it just remains to say thank you to our speaker for very engaging.
Pair of spectacles in the toilet on the shelf. Just like,
Am I wearing good? What am I saying? Yeah, that'll get me good
But
see the chap at the river dance around. Did you know
Maybe he was.